thank you to those of you who've come in for this second panel and for those of you who have stayed for it. We're here to discuss in the second panel today Prime Minister Modi's upcoming trip to Israel, which will be in early July, less than a couple of weeks after he's visited here. 25 years ago, India and Israel established full relations, full diplomatic relations. The India-Israel relationship is a close one and has been broadened and deepened by multiple Indian governments since 1992. But it's only over the last few years that it's become a much more public relationship under the Modi government. It will become obviously more visible, even more so in early July, with this Modi visit to Israel. One of the questions we're going to be discussing is, amongst other things, how come it's becoming more visible? But we're also going to look at more broadly kind of what has been driving this India-Israel relationship. Where does India fit in Israeli strategy and vice versa? What's the current state of the partnership? And what might be expected from this visit in particular? We're going to do kind of something slightly different this time in the sense that I will double as moderator and panelist. So I will be one of the panelists. I'm, as those of you who've been here know, I'm Tanvi Madan. I'm director of the India project and a fellow in our foreign policy program here at Brookings. To my left is Natan Sachs, director of the Center for Middle East Policy here at Brookings, who is co-hosting this event. And he's also a fellow in the foreign policy program here. And to my right, Sadanand Dhume, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute next door, as well as South Asia columnist for the Wall Street Journal, who have detailed bios in terms of on kind of the handouts you have. We're here to talk Israel, though it just struck me that the other country that Natan and Sadanand have in common is Indonesia. So we could probably do an entire panel on that, especially with Arthur over here. But we'll leave that for another day. What we are going to kind of talk about is this trip. And what I was going to do was lay out the state of the relationship, what to expect from the visit. Natan will talk about kind of the Israeli perspective on this and how this is seen from Israel. He's just back from there just a couple of days ago. And then Sadanand will talk a little bit about the domestic political drivers and the dynamics in India related to this relationship, and then we'll turn to Q&A. Just in terms of the state of the relationship, this is, as I said, a very close relationship, and there have been essentially kind of four kind of broad aspects where this has been, or areas where this has been a close relationship. I think the primary and the one that gets talked about the most is kind of the basket of defense and security cooperation. And that security cooperation has kind of broadened and deepened not just homeland security and counterterrorism, but increasingly discussions on cybersecurity cooperation as well as border management. This has been driven somewhat, to some extent, by shared concerns about terrorism and other security matters, but also commercial interests as well. Israel's quest for additional defense market has meant that it has sought the Indian market, which is India's one of the largest importers of defense equipment in the world. And this has been kind of a mutual benefit. Today, India has become the largest external market for Israeli suppliers. Israel, in turn, has become, especially the figures that I have are that in the year, kind of 3 fiscal years ending in March 2016, Israel was the third largest supplier for India. And as the Indian president kind of remarked when he went as the first Indian president to visit Israel a couple of years ago, he said what makes this particularly special, this defense partnership and this strategic partnership, is that Israel has been, he said it cryptically, he said Israel has been there at the toughest times or when others haven't. Kind of the reliability that even when India has faced sanctions or times that others haven't been willing to supply India, that Israeli defense equipment has gone to India. And so you do see this kind of level of trust as well as kind of bureaucratic familiarity that has made this kind of defense and security partnership quite key in the relationship. It's not, we don't know much publicly about some aspects of it, but nonetheless it gets talked about much more. One area that doesn't get talked about much more, but in some ways perhaps has created constituencies for the Israel relationship in India to a greater extent than any of the others, is the cooperation the two countries have in the agricultural sector. You've seen, and this is kind of really a bottom-up effort with Israel, long before other countries did this, engaging with state governments in India in terms of kind of water management, research and development, sharing of best practices, and kind of broadly the area of irrigation. And there's some kind of plans in terms of desalination technology which might move forward as well. Israel's also going to set up to 30 centers of excellence in this area. I think about a dozen have already been set up. The third kind of broad area that has kind of been growing over time, but as the two governments have highlighted at various times, is the economic relationship. The two governments have acknowledged that it hasn't kind of gone as far and as fast as it could, and they'd like to take it further, as kind of the trade and investment side. They've been negotiating a free trade agreement for a while. Bilateral trade stands about kind of 4 or 5 billion, somewhere between $4 and $5 billion. And they've really been trying to get this, and this is just non-defense trade because that's calculated separately by the two countries. And so they've been trying to kind of get this kind of jump-started a little bit, as well as the investment side. And one of the kind of areas that the two countries have been looking at in particular, because they're both hubs of, in terms of information technology, is kind of cooperation in that sector, or greater kind of cross-country investment is one area they've been looking at. Finally, I would say, in terms of kind of, you'd put this both in the economic box as well as the people-to-people ties box, is the kind of question of tourism and education ties. Tourism has been kind of an interesting feature in the relationship because kind of the numbers vary, but essentially about 50,000 people a year go from one country to the other. This is striking from kind of the Israeli side, given kind of the population of Israel being nothing in comparison to India. But a number of Israelis travel, and I know Natan's going to talk a little bit more about that in his remarks. But there's also been an effort to try to kind of increase educational exchanges over time and kind of have students from each side, and particularly Indian students, go out to Israel. And that's an area that people have been kind of focusing on. So what can we expect from this visit? I mean, the primary kind of thing from coming out of this visit, the takeaway will be the symbolic value of it. This is the first visit by an Indian prime minister to Israel, a country, as I said, that India has had kind of historic ties with, not just since 1992 when they normalized relations, but even before that. Even though they weren't talked about as much in a number of the wars India has fought, Israel has provided support, but there's also been kind of exchanges over time. But this is really kind of that first visit, and therefore kind of I think we'll see a visit that will be very much about the optics. A lot of Prime Minister Modi's visits are and trips are, but I think they're making kind of an extra effort to highlight different these kind of 4 or 5 different aspects of the relationship that I mentioned. These will be kind of highlighted in different ways during this visit. The messaging coming out of New Delhi is, we want to reflect the fact this is more than a defense relationship. Having said that, we have seen, and I'll talk about this just in a minute, we have seen kind of some defense agreements signed in advance of the visit itself. I think you'll also see, in terms of the optics, kind of the desire to kind of highlight the fact that the two countries are democracies. And I think you'll see that with Modi perhaps speaking to elected Israeli leaders. But I think you'll also see that with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Modi spending as much time as possible with each other. Natan's the expert on Israeli domestic politics, and so we'll talk about kind of maybe how that could help Netanyahu domestically and globally. But they have been known to get along and have kind of spent some time with each other, either together face to face, tweeting at each other, or kind of on the sidelines of summits. Another kind of part of this symbolic value and kind of what will be highlighted in terms of optics is the presence of thousands of Jews of Indian origin who are Israeli citizens. We will likely see a diaspora event that Prime Minister Modi is known to do in a number of places that he visits, probably slightly smaller just because of sheer numbers, but we will see that. And I think on the people-to-people side, people-to-people ties side, I think we're likely to see, we've already seen Air India suggest that they're going to start a direct flight from Delhi to Tel Aviv. They don't have a direct flight between the two countries. El Al does, though I believe it's to Mumbai. But I think you also might see some announcements in terms of visa policies towards the other countries. Just briefly, in terms of actual agreements, what might be signed, what might not be. As I said, they want to kind of get beyond the defense factor, but in some ways this visit has already been an action-forcing event. We've seen a few deals that have been kind of in the works for a while, signed in the last couple of months. We saw a deal for advanced surface-to-air missiles worth $2 billion. These are going to be jointly developed, but being announced in April. I understand this is one of the largest defense deals for an Israeli company ever signed. And more recently, we saw another deal worth $630 million signed for an Israeli and Indian company to collaborate to equip 4 Indian Navy ships with missile defense systems. So I think you might see a couple of other deals that they're trying to kind of push through in the meantime. But as was mentioned in the previous panel, other than with Russia, Indian leaders with visits haven't tended to kind of mention defense deals because it makes the relationship seem too transactional, and I think they want to highlight this more broadly. The other agreement we are looking to see if there's going to be any movement on is kind of the free trade agreement that the two countries have been negotiating. I think there have been 9 or 10 rounds of discussions, and looking to see whether there will be any movement on that front. I think you will also see some announcements of ways that Israel, the Israeli government, Israeli companies, as well as kind of research and development and universities might be helping achieve, might help fit into some of Prime Minister Modi's domestic goals. Israel's already offered at a government level help in terms of the Clean Ganga program that Prime Minister Modi has featured or highlighted, and also some of these defense deals, for example, are already doing kind of moving forward in terms of the Make in India concept of manufacturing in India as well. Just finally, I will say in terms of what else to watch out for. I'm also watching out for the language that the Prime Minister uses, particularly in terms of, and we'll come back to this perhaps in question and answers, the question of what has been called India's de-hyphenation of its relationship with the Israelis and Palestinians. India de facto recognizes, it supports a two-state solution, it recognizes a Palestinian state. When Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, was in India, he was referred to, as leaders have been, as the president of the state of Palestine. He was kind of given kind of a week-long visit. But what was striking about that is one of the reasons he visited India is that Prime Minister Modi will not be doing what most prime ministers, or not prime ministers, but most leaders have done, most ministers, and the Indian president did when he went, which is visit Ramallah as well. And so Modi has essentially, it is not in his schedule to go to the West Bank. And this is kind of the most visible form of this kind of de-hyphenation, following kind of separate tracks or parallel track policies towards Israelis and Palestinians. But the language that I'm looking for is, when Abu Mazen was in India, Prime Minister Modi expressed support for, quote, a sovereign, independent, united and viable Palestine coexisting peacefully with Israel. What was interesting about this is the phrase that was missing in what he said, and what Indian formulations have usually included, which was the phrase, with East Jerusalem as capital. Will we see him mention this or not? Will he mention the issue at all? We don't know about that, but that's something to watch out for during this visit. With that, I'm going to turn to Natan to talk a little bit about how this looks from Israel. Place this India relationship in the broader context of Israeli foreign policy. and what makes this relationship perhaps different from some of the others?
Thank you, Tanvi, and thank you all. I think Israeli foreign policy in some regards is a very anomalous one, and maybe not in the way one often thinks. Israeli foreign policy, first and foremost, is about the United States. So Israeli foreign policy is its American policy. And then there's all sorts of other things, all the other countries of the world. And all of these things, all the other countries of the world, and often even the United States thing, is hyphenated. Right? Everything is always, the way others regard Israel, always seems to be hyphenated with the Palestinian issue, which you can imagine the Israeli Prime Minister and many Israelis don't love. So everything is about Israel, sometimes Israel even / Palestine, as if to say it's not even clear if it's the same thing, if one should replace the other. At best, it's hyphenated at two very closely related issues. This is especially true with the second most important relationship that Israel has, which is with the European Union and European countries in general, which are by far the largest trading partner of Israel. So for the Israeli economy, they're absolutely essential, but also for the Israeli academy, for many different aspects of the Israeli economy and Israeli society. And then, suddenly, Israel discovers this whole realm of other possible relations that have nothing to do with Europe, that are less hyphenated, especially now, that seem to offer this wonderful opportunity, and in particular, that's in Asia. So Israel has had its own pivot to Asia, in a sense, just like the American previous administration, of rebalancing and almost trying to convince itself that, okay, well, if Europe is going to constantly annoy us with the settlement issue and the pesky Palestinian talks and all that kind of stuff, well, we can turn to Asia, and we can find opportunities there. I'll start immediately by saying this is grossly exaggerated to some degree. No one in Asia is about to replace the European Union in terms of the economic importance and many other aspects as well. The Palestinian issue is not going to disappear, and it's not like Asian countries don't care about it at all. But it does mean that there's a whole realm of opportunities here from the Israeli perspective that are very important and are untied to and maybe untethered by previous concerns. Unlike in some realms, in this Asia pivot, Israel has been quite strategic and quite deliberate. The Prime Minister's office, for quite a few years now, has had a good process in place, in some respects at least, not in all of these aspects, and serious people in charge of these relationships. It's not just India, it's China, perhaps first China, but then India as well, Japan, South Korea. There's been quite a bit of care from the Prime Minister, this Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office in general, not to play favorites among them, because the last thing Israel needs is to get involved in more quarrels somewhere else in the world. So trying to say, of course, no one is at the expense of anyone else, in particular China or India. But then India, if we think of it just for a moment, in structural terms, is this beautiful opportunity for Israel that almost has no cost. Usually the cost would be that whoever your rival is then going to be angry with a country that is approaching it. So in this case, perhaps I could say Pakistan. Well, Israel has very little prospects of relations with Pakistan anyway. And in fact, to a certain degree, the rivalry with a large Muslim rival and questions of terrorism, etc., especially in the way it's perceived by the governments now in Israel and in India, actually offers room for cooperation, certainly on the intelligence and security side, which is robust and big. It's not just arms sales, it's cooperation, training, a lot of other things. But also in terms of the way they situate themselves in the world. Now, for years, I'm sure we'll discuss this later, but for years, India was, of course, aligned with the non-aligned movement, a founding member, and then also the Soviet Union to a certain degree. Israel was very clearly from the beginning on the Western side, increasingly on the American side, at least from the 70s, if not earlier. And in that regard, they were always rivals. As soon as this issue, as this block for the relations started to dissipate with the falls of the Soviet Union, with the Oslo process in particular, with the rapprochement or the closening of relations between India and the United States, then the opportunity for Israel grew dramatically. So if you ask me inside Israel, what's the view of the Indian relationship, it's actually one of the easiest questions I've ever met. Positive. Great. No one in Israel thinks anything else about it. There's no controversy about it. On the contrary, there's a feeling this is a wonderful opportunity for recognition. That's part of why for Netanyahu, tweeting in Hindi at Prime Minister Modi, congratulations for your elections, and then receiving a Hebrew tweet from New Delhi saying congratulations to you, my friend Bibi, in good Hebrew, by the way, This is wonderful. This is great, great politics domestically. It's cost-free. There's no anti-India lobby in Israel, and I don't expect there would ever be one, at least until Pakistan has beautiful relations with Israel. It, of course, has none at the moment whatsoever. And in that regard, it's cost-free. What does Israel want out of it? Well, Israel, despite being powerful, etc., still has some hang-ups that go back to the early days of May 1948, and that's a craving for recognition. Simply recognition by a major world power, one where whose future is ahead of it, is a benefit in Israeli eyes. It's a big one, in fact. It's a stamp of approval, of legitimacy. The dehyphenation can sound like a sort of wonky foreign policy issue, but for Israelis, it's very important. The idea that Israel could actually be discussed as a real country and not just as part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very important to Israelis and is one that they appreciate dramatically. But secondly, if we think not just about the geopolitics, but about the actual countries themselves and the economy, there's huge opportunity for growth here. There's great complementarity. It can sound odd. Israel's a country of 8.5 million. India's a bit larger than that. And so of course, there are limits to this complementarity.
Delhi is a bit larger than that.
Delhi is significantly larger than that, exactly. I was one of those Israeli backpackers in India, and people would turn to me and think that Israel is probably around the size of Russia or the United States or anything like that, because India or some places are awash with Israeli backpackers, and they would not be convinced that Israel is tiny. But this, in fact, adds to it. Many Israelis have been to India and have very fond feelings towards India. And this can sound trivial, but it's not. It means that many Israelis have an idea of what India looks like, what different parts of India might look like, about the vastness of the country, the diversity of it, the diversity of opportunities and resources, the difference between what Mumbai might look like or what some of the many different parts of the country would look like very differently from Mumbai. All this offers opportunity because those same backpackers who came out of the military go roaming around, rampaging around India, then they are many of the players in the economy, and that's quite important. In terms of economic terms, Israel has a lot of expertise in many of the things that India needs, and so India provides a huge potential market for many of these things. Arms and weapons are certainly part of that story. They're a big part of that story, but they're not the only one. Water technology is a very big one. Israel sits just on the border of the desert. More than half of the Israeli territory, the small Israeli territory, is desert itself. So there's a lot of Israeli expertise in water, desal now, agriculture, especially in arid areas. This is something that Israelis have been working on since the 50s, before even, and have a lot of expertise. And so in India, that has a lot of potential. And I would say one more thing. This also has potential in human terms. If you think of just the needs of the vast Indian population, a lot of the high tech that we hear about in Israel, a lot of it is apps that help you navigate ways from here to there. But there are a lot of other things too, things that can save lives. There's one company I was speaking to recently in Israel that operates medical devices, mobile medical devices, that in a place with a lot of need and relatively few sources per capita can just save many thousands of lives. So there's a wealth of opportunities there for growth. Let me go back a bit for a moment to the foreign policy realm of this. I think a lot of it, and I think it's quite apparent in Washington as well, we should remember is in the context of the U.S. relations with India. So this panel comes after the previous one, and I don't think it's by chance. Israel, a lot of its foreign policy at the end of the day is dictated by questions of global spheres and of closeness to the United States. In the 70s, perhaps the most important development in Israeli foreign policy, the peace with Egypt, had to do with Egypt leaving the Soviet sphere and moving to the American one. And in the 90s, a lot of what happened in the opening of doors, not just in Delhi, but elsewhere, Turkey, China, elsewhere, had to do with the notion that in a unipolar world, everyone wanted to get to Washington, and that the road to Washington maybe doesn't go through Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, but is helped by stopping in Jerusalem and or Tel Aviv along the way. And there's a similar effort here as well. The closeness with the Israelis is always related to that too. Finally, I think one more aspect that I think is important to mention is the question of what the cooperation actually entails. Israelis, when you talk to them, Israeli officials, when you talk to them about Israeli relations around the world, they will often take pride in the fact that they are there when they are needed, and not just with countries that officially have recognition with Israel or recognize Israel and have official ties, but with other countries with which Israel has contacts as well. Now in the Middle East, we're talking about many things. One of them is about this convergence of interest between Israel and many of the Sunni Arab states that were traditional rivals, even enemies of Israel, Saudi-Israeli relations in particular. The Israelis will often intimate that the relations are deeper than one thinks, and that a lot of it has to do with the Israelis being there when their partners need them. And this is especially true on the intelligence side. Israel has a very robust intelligence apparatus. It's less robust than many people's imagination, but it is still robust. And Israel has often, from very early on, even before relations with the United States were strong, Israel has used that card to curry favor with other governments. One of the first things the Israelis gave the Americans were documents about the Soviet revelations of Stalin's regime in the 50s. And this helped solidify intelligence relations with the United States, and similarly today with everyone else. That is probably true with India as well. Intelligence sharing, an attempt to help the Indians with a very serious terrorist threat that they have. All these things are very important from the Israeli perspective. So in short, it's non-controversial, which is, I don't think I've ever said that about any Israeli policy. Inside Israel, everyone's for it, period. There's just no one against it. Two, and also actually rather unusual, Israel has been strategic, deliberate, and I think handled it quite well in quite a few years. That is not always the case, but perhaps because it's not a heightened partisan issue inside Israel, it's allowed the bureaucracy and the Prime Minister's office in particular to do it very seriously, the Foreign Ministry as well. And third, the room for growth here is dramatic. I'll add one more thing, if I may, on this. Please. On arms as well. If you think of China, the other huge gambit, Japan is very important too, but the other huge gambit in Asia, there's always the limitation on sharing of technology and on weapons, because as keen as Israelis are on a pivot to Asia, they know exactly what the most important capital is, and that's this one right here. So with China in particular, there were two big arms deals that were cut short, one for unmanned aerial vehicles, and even before that for AWACS, or Falcon it's called in Israel, but adapted aerial intelligence and command and control systems. And these were blocked by the Americans that said, you who received all this money from us in aid, you cannot sell something that might face us in the Taiwan Straits. With India, the Americans have limitations, but these are not them. They're much easier. And so the Israeli cooperation on that, too, has been free from these constraints, or by and large free from these constraints, that we've seen repeatedly on the Chinese side. And for the Israelis, the question of how to move forward with China is something that they deal with all the time. It's a question that's still on the table for them and the Americans to figure out what the boundaries are. With India, it's been much simpler, and many of the same systems, including the Falcon, were actually sold to India, and we see a wide variety of those things still happening. So in short, in terms of the future, I think there's actually an enormous amount of potential for growth. If anything, the limitation is just a matter of scale, of actually Israeli scale. It's just a small country. So perhaps there are limitations there.
Thanks, Natan. Sanan, before we kind of talk about the future again, kind of just looking back into the past a little bit. Natan talked about kind of Israeli agricultural, technological, and kind of water management technique development going back to the 50s.
Hope you're not going to ask me about that.
No. But I was going to I'll get to the point of the politics of this, which is, it reminded me of a memo I saw that Prime Minister Nehru wrote in the 50s, where he was engaging with one of his agricultural kind of senior bureaucrats in the agricultural field, and he said, the country with whom it makes most sense for us to engage with on this subject, the natural partner would be Israel. But for political reasons, we can't. And he did not even elaborate what they were, but over time, they've tended to be the two kind of things that are, why did it take so long for India to normalize relations, as well as kind of, once it was normalized, why keep it kind of hidden? We've heard different formulations of this, some that can be mentioned in a public audience and others, but essentially why has it been kept hidden or kind of in the closet? Has been kind of this, one aspect was India's relations with the Arab countries, but the second has been domestic politics, particularly related to India's tens of millions of Muslims, but also kind of a broader aspect. Talk a little bit about those domestic political dynamics, how they are different in this case, whether you think they still play a role to the extent, and also how in some ways this is a visit that Prime Minister Modi's political base has been expecting and perhaps would have wanted to see even sooner.
Well, thanks, Tanvi. I'm going to start my comments with an anecdote, which I think really sort of captures exactly this change that you're speaking about. In July 2014, almost exactly 3 years ago, there was a UN Human Rights Council resolution which recommended a probe against Israel for its offensive in the Gaza Strip. What you saw immediately after that, and India voted for that resolution. This was just 2 months after Modi, less than 2 months after Modi had been sworn in. Immediately you saw this backlash against the Indian vote. And I've sort of gathered a few of these sort of quotes from Twitter. Here's someone saying, "As an Indian, I oppose and reject the vote and hashtag I am with Israel." Here's another one. "The government's UN vote against Israel is not a minor error. It's a monumental blunder." There was an article 2 days later in the Economic Times with the headline, "It's time the government got its act together." Now, to put this in perspective and sort of explain how astounding this is, the India where I grew up, on my passport, there was a stamp which said that there are 2 countries that I was not allowed to visit: India, Israel, and South Africa. So it gives you a sense of how much and how far not only the country itself has traveled in terms of its diplomacy and its relationship, but also in terms of public opinion. And now the tweets that I mentioned and the article were all by people who, in the run-up to the 2014 election, had been seen as broadly supportive of Narendra Modi. And so the pitch and the depth of the disappointment that they were reflected really an aspect of this domestic political conversation about Israel. The idea that a Modi prime ministership would signal a broad departure in foreign policy, but specifically on Israel, a sharper and clearer embrace of Israel as an ally. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the sources of the sort of both the opposition and support for Israel in domestic politics, very, very briefly, and then I'm going to throw it forward with a few thoughts about where I think things are headed. When you speak about Israel in Indian domestic politics, it's quite striking because India, in many ways, is like the United States. It's a very large and very inward-looking country. It's not as though foreign policy tends to play a very large role in Indian elections. And to the degree that people think about foreign countries at all in domestic politics, you have the usual suspects: the United States, obviously, because it's the one country that everybody thinks about; China, because there's a border issue; Pakistan, depending on what's happening in terms of terrorism and so on. But in certain parts of the country, obviously, the relationship with Pakistan has some salience. And in a more sort of limited regional sense, in Tamil Nadu, for instance, they'd care about the relationship with Sri Lanka. In Bengal, they'd care about the relationship with Bangladesh and so on. But Israel is sort of not in any of these buckets, and yet it matters. And I would say that it matters in 2 ways that are quite different and striking. The first is it's an ideological hot-button issue. It's not as though any regular or most regular Indian voters, right? It's not as though some peasant in some village in Bihar is sort of waking up and trudging to the polling booth on election day and saying that, well, what does this candidate really think of the UN resolution about Gaza or whatever? It's sort of very, very far from people's minds in that sense. But you do have, for opinion makers, for ideologues, for intellectuals, this is a hot-button issue. It evokes a great deal of passion, and it's one of the dividing lines between the left and the right in India. The second is that, to a large extent, I would say that India's conversation about Israel, I mean, it is all the things Tanvi spoke about, and the counterterrorism cooperation and agriculture and trade and all these things that you can sort of look at in traditional foreign policy terms. But I'd say it's also a conversation that India is having about itself and its past, which is very interesting in a way that sort of how Israel has, probably in a way that most Israelis don't understand, become a kind of proxy for certain kind of very sensitive conversations that India is having about itself, the conduct of its own foreign policy in the past, and what kind of country it wants to be, and so on. Now, the sources of opposition and support. Now, I would say that, broadly speaking, to sort of come back to, why this thing was so slow, I'd say that there were two reasons, right? So you have two blocks of people who even now would be, are not in favor of a completely full, open, explicit embrace of Israel. You would have the sort of, the nostalgists for Nehruvian foreign policy, people like Mani Shankar Iyer, who think it's an abomination that India even has diplomatic relations with Israel, and we should all sort of wait for this horrible Zionist entity to disappear off the face of this earth. And then you obviously have the communists who have, for various ideological reasons, particularly over the past few decades, had a real problem with the very idea that India has effectively pivoted. It has not abandoned its support for the Palestinian cause, but it has very clearly pivoted away from that more towards Israel in terms of its priorities. So there are no surprises over there. But what's more interesting, I think, are the sources of support, and I would sort of, broadly divide it into three categories. And again, emphasizing that we're not talking about grassroots. We're not talking about the kind of people Nathan, would have encountered while backpacking. We're talking about sort of, intellectual elites, opinion makers, and so on. So I would say the three kind of categories would be, I'd say, realists, people who kind of recognize that the old Indian, reflexively pro-Arab position was not really getting it too much. The idea that that India could somehow appeal to the Arab countries by being, holier than the Pope when it came to being hostile towards Israel. India, voted in 1975 for the Zionism as racism resolution. It was, of course, one of the first non-Arab countries to recognize the Palestinians, and so on. There was a sort of growing realization that this wasn't getting India very much, and also a growing understanding, coming back to sort of that memo in the 1950s or whatever, that there are great opportunities that were not being realized. And then you have the realists. Then you have, mainstream Hindu nationalists, and to a large degree, this conversation is about. There's a great admiration for Israel, and I think I'd say that most Hindu nationalists probably view Israel in the way that many Americans do. They view it as this, doughty, plucky country that has stood up for itself. It happens to be located in a very hostile part of the world and has done a great job of defending its borders and defending itself. And then you have a third part, which we don't really often sort of talk about, but I think needs to be put on the table, which is the lunatics. And there is a sort of, there's this lunatic fringe support for Israel too. And that, quite frankly and quite unfortunately, really comes down to, look at these guys, they know how to stick it to the Muslims. Now, each of these three, I'd say each of these sort of three have kind of, at a certain level, they may sort of blend into each other in different ways. But what you're seeing is, let's say the first two are dominant, and you're seeing this change. You start seeing this in the early 1990s, and many people who are sort of for the relationship are really looking out for, like, look, this is something that is beneficial to India. But the conversation that I think that many people in the BJP are having is slightly different. I'm not saying they're the only people who have this idea of Israel, but I'd say it's predominant there. And some of the elements there, for instance, are this idea that the Jews and the Hindus are both very ancient peoples. Now, this goes back all the way to Savarkar, who was the main sort of Hindu nationalist ideologue, and who once sort of famously said that, well, when he was asked about Israel, and he said that, well, of course, Israel is the homeland of the Jews. It was the homeland of the Jews 2,000 years before the Prophet Muhammad was born, which is a very, very different idea from, say, what Nehru held, who, we're celebrating 100 years of the Balfour Declaration. He opposed the Balfour Declaration. He thought that the idea, and Gandhi also sort of was very explicit in saying that, Palestine is for the Arabs the way England is for the English. And so the Hindu nationalist movement, in that sense, always had this different view. So there's one idea. One is this sort of idea of honoring or understanding this notion of an ancient connection to a land and a place that is based, at least partly, on faith. There's also this idea that, and there have been a flurry of recent articles about this, which has been quite fascinating, about the Israeli experience and the Indian experience being similar in the sense of both expressing the kind of political rebirth of a people. That these are people who did not have political power. And again, this is where the sort of Hindu nationalist discourse and imagination diverges from the more traditional Indian view, because the more traditional Indian view was that, Islam came to India and was as Indian as anything else. But for many Hindu nationalists, the period of Islamic rule is essentially viewed as a period of foreign rule. And so when India is born in 1947 as a Republic of India and Israel a year later in 1948, the way they're looking at this is that for the first time in a long, long time, these are ancient peoples who now have the chance to wield political power over and forge their own destinies. And then, of course, there's this idea that opposition to the sort of this notion that India should forge Hindu-Muslim unity by using its foreign policy. And this is obviously goes back not just to the, to how many people on the right view the Indian position on Palestine, but also actually weirdly to the Khilafat movement, right? And this goes back to sort of, again, a philosophical divide, which is the Khilafat movement, for those of you who sort of was in the 1920s. Gandhi started this movement where he protested the Turkish abolition of the caliphate. And he sort of thought that he would, by doing this, he would build bridges between Hindus and Muslims in their joint fight against the British. And this is something that was sort of, always opposed in Hindu nationalist circles, and is sort of looked upon as, putting the cart before the horse. So, I mean, all this is a sort of somewhat long-winded way of saying that the philosophical sources of what is changing, I think, are quite profound. And so I'll just sort of sum up with, looking ahead. And my own sense of this is that you now have a very strong consensus. So you have the sort of, realist view, which is that this is a very important relationship for all these sort of concrete reasons. But you also have this more kind of mystical, almost romantic idea of Israel, which has really grown in prominence, I would say, particularly over the last 3 years. And then along with that, I would say, and this is not just confined to foreign policy, I would say that you have this broader shift going on in India where it's a sort of revolt against old elites. As I put it sometimes flippantly, a revolt against people who can spell. And
spent too much time on Twitter.
I sure do. And I think, part of this revolt against old elites is also a revolt against past policies. And for whatever reason, I think Israel has ended up being a great beneficiary of this, because the sense that, well, the failure to recognize Israel was a great symbol of a broader failure is something that certainly places stronger India-Israel relations in a more positive light for the sort of people who I think are dominant today and are, in my opinion, likely to remain dominant for a while. Thanks.
Thanks, Sadan. And it's worth commenting, though, that in this case, it's actually striking that despite these differences in kind of the philosophical and ideological dimension, that what is different is the visibility. The policy itself, that it was a Congress government that, in 92, Congress-led government that established these relations. And it has actually been a relationship for some of those structural reasons that has deepened despite whether there's been a Congress-led government or a BJP-led government. And arguably the defense relationship that we talk about so much, it really was in kind of the last decade that it really took on a different character. And I'd say that kind of visibility is actually something you've also seen as a feature of Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy, which is this attitude that if we have these relationships, so why are we hiding? So if we have differences with China, let's talk about them publicly. If we have this close relationship with the US, why not invite an American president to be chief guest of India's Republic Day? And frankly, if we have this relationship with the Palestinians, why not for the first time, and this has happened under the Modi government, start foreign office consultations with the Palestinians as a separate state? And so in that sense, it's almost as much a part of that. But one of the things I kind of want to go back to and can maybe set this relationship in the broader setting of the Middle East, partly because I think one thing that has changed that has arguably made this relationship from India's perspective at least easier is kind of the Middle East and kind of the other parts of the Middle East, Iran and particularly the Arab states. And then one very realistic reasons that along with NAM, along with kind of this view that perception that politicians had that this would hurt them at the polls if they had certain voting blocs, was this very real idea that India was heavily dependent for oil on the Middle East. And kind of putting that 1975 resolution in the context of what was happening with the energy crisis. And then that India didn't have very much leverage with these countries, and particularly the GCC countries, who had, not just because of India's oil dependence on them, but because of the many millions of Indians that work there, leverage that India did not have and arguably today has, partly because of market power. And that has made it easier. But kind of in those dynamics, I've just got to, I actually have a question for both of you on this. But Modi is also, because of that, before he ever is getting to Israel, he has been to Saudi Arabia, he went to Iran, he went to the UAE, he went to Qatar, he's hosted the Turkish leader, he's hosted the Egyptian president as well. So he's made sure he's done these rounds. Natan, for you, how are these kind of relations seen from kind of the Israeli perspective? This kind of, not just the kind of Arab state, and if you could talk a little bit about what's been happening with the Israelis and the Saudis, but also particularly Iran, that has kind of come up, including in conversation here. And so then you can respond to what I said, but also, you know, the one thing I think both of you alluded to was this idea that the Indian relationship with Israel has helped create a constituency for it in the US. I think Natan referred to the opposite, that the relationship with the US has created a constituency in Israel. But on the other hand, India's relationship with Iran, Sadan, has also created complications, or with Iran in the Middle East has created complications with the US. So how do these dynamics play out in terms of balancing these various relationships? And if you could also comment, since we are meeting just after President Trump went to Israel and Saudi Arabia, and you've just returned from India, how that visit was seen in India. So
thanks a lot.
Sadan, you can go.
So I think in many ways the challenge for India has been to sort of reconcile a sort of its broader traditional foreign policy with some of these new political undercurrents. And I think it's done a very good job of it. I think so the visit itself is going to acknowledge what Modi's base wants and what has changed. But all that has come before that, you know, including Abbas's visit to India, including India reaching out very actively to the Saudis and other Gulf countries, including shows that there's a sort of maturity in the policy process, and then this sort of and continuity, and everything isn't just sort of thrown overboard, and sort of things don't just lurch in one direction or the other. And I think your point, I agree with the sort of core point of yours that the relationship was established under Congress, but I do have a kind of caveat there, which is sort of one of those things we'll never know. It was established at a point when the Nehru-Gandhi family was not in charge of the Congress. And I think that is extremely important because in many ways the baggage that the Congress carries here is the baggage of history. And what we saw again during 2004 to 2014 when the Congress was in power, certainly they didn't roll back, they didn't end the relationship, but you did see things go beyond. Sort of the two big things you saw was one, what you mentioned, which was that the relationship was then suddenly put in the closet, right? So you don't have any prime ministerial visit. Of course, you also didn't have an Israeli prime minister or president visit in those 10 years. And I would sort of speak privately with so many Israeli diplomats who would really sort of felt quite upset about that. But there were also substantive changes, right? So the language you referred to, for instance, on East Jerusalem as a capital, which was not there also, had been removed when Abbas met with Modi recently. That was put in during the UPA. So there was a sort of clear sense over those 10 years that, well, maybe we shouldn't go so far. And that is a reflection partly of history, but partly also of politics. Now, in a different context, I'll sort of relate a sort of small conversation I had with an MP which has nothing to do with Israel, but it shows you how the domestic political dynamics of these things work. There was a lunch for Bush when Bush was visiting India, 2008 or 2000. When?
No, it was before. 2006.
So in any case, and so this MP decided that he would not go for this lunch, and I was sort of like, why? And he says there are all these Muslim groups in my constituency who really hate this guy, and if I go, I'm not going to get any extra votes. But if I skip it, it might be. He had nothing against him. It was nothing. It was just completely. And I'd say that that kind of crude political logic was part of that. Really did inform India's policy towards Israel. And now, when you see a sort of what you're seeing in part is a backlash against that. Very quickly on the sort of trip to Saudi Arabia, I think that many people in India have been profoundly disappointed, partly because
on Trump's trip.
Now, I always thought this was completely unrealistic, and I sort of you and I think had somewhat similar views on this. There was this cartoonish notion, particularly in elements of the Indian right, that Trump was going to come with his big stick and fix the terrorism problem, and then he goes to Saudi Arabia of all places. And sort of goes on and on about how it's going to, this wonderful place that is going to be central to cooperation against this and so on. And I think a lot of people just sort of, you could see this sort of, almost see the scales fall from their eyes. So I don't think that's been taken well. And there's certainly kind of, questions about how reliable is the U.S. on this.
Nathan?
Well, let me start from the Middle East side. Yeah. In the Middle East, in general, for Netanyahu and many others, top priority is Iran. And there was and remains that. And so a lot of what's happening in terms of the Israeli relations in the region is with Iran in the backdrop. So cooperation today that is growing between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others, in particular Jordan and Egypt, which already have peace and relations with Israel. All this is in the backdrop, the idea of a group of countries that have their first priority is the same, which is standing up to Iran, preventing Iranian attempts at influence in the region, in Syria and Lebanon, in Yemen and Libya, etc., and in the Gaza Strip to a certain degree. And so, from that perspective, we see this new alignment of interest between Israel and a closeness between Israel and traditional Sunni Arab states, in particular Saudi Arabia, which is quite dramatic. Saudi Arabia literally was at war in Israel, very symbolically, but there was a state of war, or is a state of war actually. And in that case, it's very dramatic. Now, how do Israelis regard great powers or large countries like India with relations with others in the region? The truth is there's a mix of realism and a bit of hypocrisy. So the realism is, if you're India or if you're Japan, which has very important relations with Iran, including energy relations, you're going to get away with it. Israel understands exactly that Japan has interests in the Middle East that have nothing to do with Israel, that have to do with energy at scales that Israel has no way to compete with. And so what I mentioned before about Israel craving recognition, the side that craves recognition is happy if you're given recognition, even if you have relations with everyone else. And in that regard, it's still an old kind of attitude to it, but it's a healthy one. It's one that doesn't expect India to try and now adjudicate stuff in the Middle East. On the contrary, Israel is very happy to have India and other powers in Asia just regard the Middle East as a faraway issue that maybe they have sympathies towards the Palestinians, and that's fine, but it would not dictate the way they have policy. And similarly would not want them to come and try and adjudicate Middle East issues. There is a limit to that, however. So first there's an hypocrisy. If it's a very small country, Israel might flex its muscles. That's normal international relations. And second, that there is a limit, and the limit is on security, intelligence, proliferation issues. When it comes to that, then the Israelis take a very hard line. So even with Russia, which is, of course, extremely powerful, much larger, all that, the Israelis do try to push back as much as they can on transfer of, for example, advanced anti-aircraft systems to the Iranians, even though it's clearly in Russian commercial interest, and is an issue of discussion between the Israelis and the Russians. Not a simple one, but the Israelis have managed sometimes to forestall the sale of anti-aircraft missiles to Iran. But that is not a problem on the Indian side, right? We're not going to see advanced Indian systems going to Iran that will tilt the scale in any kind of way. So in that regard, there's not a problem. In short, the symbolic aspect matters a lot, and the Israelis care dramatically about this recognition, about the fact that finally Israel will host an Indian prime minister. Israeli prime ministers and presidents have been to India but never reciprocated. But India actually has a free hand to a certain degree in continuing relations with everyone else. From the Israeli perspective, it's never been so much of a zero-sum game. This is part of the point of recognition. From the Israeli perspective, they always wanted it to appear as a conflict, as an issue that needs to be resolved, not a question of basic legitimacy of whether Israel can even exist. Mm-hmm. And the demand often from the other side was, don't even talk to Israel, the Zionist entity, because that would be giving ground. It's illegitimate to a certain degree. That changed a lot, of course, in recent decades, but historically that was sort of the core of it. And so when you mentioned the narrow Gandhi kind of approach of seeing even recognizing Israel as an issue, a mistake, an ideological question, that's exactly what got the Israelis mad, because their feeling was, you can think Israel should do X, Y, or Z, but to even question legitimacy, that's what got their goat.
Of course, we now know that Indira Gandhi, during the 71 war, asked and received military equipment from Israel when few others would send military aid to India. We have time for questions. If you could just, put your hands up. We'll take these three first. Please identify yourself, and if you can keep the questions short, because we've got a few, so we can get to all of them.
Thank you. My name is Veronica Cartier, International Conflicts. I wonder that you haven't spoken about your business relation between India and Israel, which is growing in the security sector. So also in the security sector, I have questioned that with the increasing rising security tension in Indo-Pacific region, and this is, I think, is very important for Modi with visit to U.S. and China aggression. Do you think maritime exercises that have been conducted between U.S., Australia, and India to include Indonesia, because now the rising tension in Strait Malacca and in the Indonesian water? Thank you.
We've got a couple of others back there.
Hi. So you mentioned the joint Indian fight against British colonists in the past. So my question is, do you think that Indians and their suffering from their colonial past would impact the way that Indians view the settler colonial reality and occupation that Palestinians live in the future and the present?
And we've got one back there, and then we'll take a second round after that.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, U.S. Foreign Service retired. I wonder if, in the long run, the freedom of action that India might feel it might like to take would perhaps be constrained by a number of factors. Number one would be the sizable Muslim population within India, and second, the possibility that the Muslim world, perhaps at the instigation of Pakistan, might re-energize the problems in Kashmir and use that as a point of leverage against India if they felt things were getting a bit too involved with Israel.
I think we've got one more back there, which we can take as well in this round.
Hi, I'm Shweta, a student at Johns Hopkins, majoring in conflict management. My question goes to the question of recognition of Israel. So I think I was sort of wondering about what exactly you meant by recognition, in the sense that India has already recognized Israel as a nation state. So, and that has been done historically. So when we talk about recognition in a very contemporary sense, do you just mean a reaffirmation by Prime Minister Modi that yes, Israel can actively exercise their control? Or I'm not really sure of what this reaffirmation of recognition means, and to what extent would that sort of impact what goes on then? Yeah.
Okay, Sadan, do you want to start on something?
Sure, I'll go really fast. I don't think the South China Sea thing is sort of to do with this particular discussion, because that's I don't think that's a sort of India-Israel thing in particular, but I think that it would be a great idea to have the Indonesians involved in their common interests in that part of the world. On this sort of settler colonial question, let me sort of answer that provocatively. The answer to your question is no. I think that there's sort of in Indian public opinion today, there is any particular deep sympathy for the Palestinians. And I think there was, in fact, a poll on this some years ago that suggested this. There are exceptions, of course, among activists and so on. And there's certainly some element of this in India's Muslim population. But generally speaking, I think India has sort of become much more sort of realist in its approach. And it would like to see a two-state solution, of course. I don't think anybody or most people don't sort of have any, would like to see any Palestinian suffering end. But I certainly don't think that India is viewing this issue through the prism of its experience with colonialism at all. In terms of long run, I think that's a really good question in terms of what happens, because ultimately India is a democracy, and in a democracy, what voters think matters. And so what you have is this tension between one view, which was that maybe the Muslim minority played a disproportionate role in determining policy. That's certainly the view on the Indian right. But then the counter to that is that in any democracy, and we're certainly seeing that play out in Europe and elsewhere, you have to take into account the views of your citizens. So is it possible to imagine a future where India's freedom of action in terms of taking this relationship forward is constrained? Yes. I would say that the domestic elements of it would be probably more important than re-energizing Kashmir and so on. But if I had to predict, at least in the sort of immediate future, I don't see that happening. Because what I see instead is much more of this sort of rising nationalism that is very sympathetic for some of the reasons I outlined to Israel.
I just add to that and then turn to Natan. On the kind of one area where I do think kind of the Indo-Pacific dimension does come into here is something Natan talked about, which is China. We will likely see the Modi government and the Xi government try to get the relationships back on track, the China-India relationship. But it's been a pretty bad 2 years. And particularly some of the things that have been set in motion with One Belt, One Road will, I think, traverse both these parts of the continent. India still calls this West Asia, not the Middle East. But also, what Israel does with China will be watched, particularly in the defense space, by India. I think this is also just going to become an issue over time. On the question of, I think, private sector collaboration, I think you've seen on the defense side quite close collaboration, and the Israelis have shown a willingness also to speak to kind of some of Prime Minister Modi's priorities in terms of not just co-development, but co-production at home, so manufacturing. So you have seen companies. It'll be interesting to see if you see greater collaboration between the Indian private sector in the defense space, which is now kind of developing more, as well as Israeli companies. So far, we've mostly seen it on the state-owned company side. And I think kind of broadly tech, I think there's a lot of, in the innovation space, in the tech space, there's potential. Just on the freedom of action, I think one of the things that has changed in terms of India's relations with particularly the Arab states is that this is really the first time we've seen in kind of decades, if not in independent India's history, that India has significant leverage with these countries. It is now it is going to be, if it's not already, the fastest growing oil consumer in the world. It is the second fastest growing, likely to be a kind of a gas importer in the world. This gives it the kind of leverage at a time of kind of much lower oil prices than these countries and gas prices had ever expected. It gives India market power and therefore leverage in a way that India never had. To give you an example, India renegotiated its long-term gas deal with Qatar in a way that wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. But also, I think some of the concerns that some of these countries never had about counterterrorism, for example, they are now actually on the security side cooperating a little more. You've also seen in kind of the maritime security space, India now engaging with these countries, whether it's in terms of port security, potential kind of defense exchanges, et cetera, in a way it didn't. So I think just kind of the nature of it's become a less asymmetrical relationship. As for their kind of, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic States, every once in of Islamic countries, they've been kind of having resolutions in Kashmir for a while. It hasn't gone very far. And I think to some extent, for a number of these countries, India, in very kind of real, tangible terms, has become a key factor that they are dehyphenating between India and Pakistan. Even Saudi Arabia, which has a special relationship with Pakistan and has been reluctant, is now kind of helping India on some things, particularly in terms of intelligence sharing and counterterrorism in a way it wasn't. It's also slightly fed up. It will not give up the Pakistan relationship. It's too important. It's a little fed up with Pakistan, given that Pakistan's refused to help in Yemen and refused to take kind of a very forward-leaning stance on things like the situation in Qatar. So I think the dynamics have changed, and for all the ideological talk, at the end of the day, this comes down to kind of very material things as well. And I'll just say to the kind of question about support for the Palestinian cause, I think it's been Indian governments, therefore, even this government, has supported and said that it doesn't want to see, it wants to see two states, and it doesn't want to see the use of violence. But one thing that has also changed in India in the last couple of decades is that there is very little sympathy now for the use of terrorism as a tool. That has changed significantly. And so things that the PLO did in the 70s would not be acceptable in terms of Indian action today. So that is something that has changed significantly. And even UPA governments that kept the Israel relationship slightly less visible but moved it forward were very conscious of that. You will not see Indian public sympathy across the board on that go very far. Nathan?
I'll be very brief. I think the question of support for the Palestinians and the colonial past, I think, is a good one. And I think throughout the world, Israel has often faced publics whose natural inclination would always be in favor of the underdog, which I think is a natural and probably healthy attitude. The Israeli perspective, again, when I mentioned, for example, on relations with India, it's not the purview just of the right wing. This is actually something that across Israel is supported, including on those who are very much against the occupation or settlements. But the the desire for recognition, this relates to the second question, the desire there is one of recognizing Israel as a party to this conflict, and then, of course, having opinions on it. And so you can think of many countries in Europe, for example, where anti-colonialism in Ireland is extremely strong. There are still full relations with Israel. There are public visits, there's business ties, there's all of the above. So the desire for recognition that I mentioned, well, first it's especially early in the state. It was literally desire for recognition. Most countries in the world did not recognize Israel at all. So I think it's a false kind of assumption that, well, Israel is recognized, what's the big deal? There was a real question of whether even it was recognized as a legitimate country. But in more recent decades, where it's less of an issue, and particularly because Israel survived, the desire has been for relations that were normalized even with deep disagreements. Obviously, Egypt, which has full relations with Israel, at least in theory, is pro-Palestinian and is against settlements, etc. Countries of Europe are against settlements. But nonetheless, they have full relations with Israel and visits at the highest level. That's kind of what I meant. I'd add one more point, and this relates to this question of sympathy for the Palestinians and the partisan. I know it wasn't addressed to me, but it's maybe part of the point, actually. The question of partisanship is one that is very dangerous from the Israeli perspective. So if Israel is associated with only a Modi approach, one which is anti-Muslim, or with Modi's own history in Gujarat, that's not a healthy basis for long-term relations. It's certainly not healthy in the United States if Israel becomes more partisan, that is obvious, but it's not healthy in other countries as well. And I think the Israelis, even this government in Israel, would be conscious of the fact that it would like relations with India, not with the BJP. It doesn't want relations with Modi, it wants relations with India, the Republic of India. It's not necessarily so simple to do. I know much less about India than anyone here, but that is something I think the Israelis are conscious of, but probably should be more conscious of, especially because questions of the Palestinians or settlements, they're not going to disappear, right? Israelis hope that in Asia no one cares. In Asia people care much less, but they still do care.
One area where, these parallel tracks, and this is why it's hard to dehyphenate, I mean, speaking on that, which does engender frustration within the Indian system, is things like when India is trying to kind of set up technology facilities, training centers in the West Bank, they have not been allowed to, for example, take in equipment, or there have been delays because of kind of restrictions or delays on the Israeli side. And this does kind of, it is where these parallel tracks kind of end up intersecting and does create a sense of frustration, even with this government, about what the Israelis have been doing. We have, since we started 5 minutes late, we have kind of maybe just to take these two questions, so then we'll end with that.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. I'm Elliot Hurwitz, a former State Department, World Bank, and intelligence community person. I'd like to ask Dr. Sachs. He talked about the relationships between Israel and the traditional Sunni states. I'd like him to expound a little bit on what their relationships are and where that might be going.
Okay.
One more question, just back there, so then we'll end that. And Nathan, if you could also add, what's the latest state of affairs in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations with Special Envoy Jared Kushner there?
40 seconds, right?
Yes.
I know all about that.
Please,
Thank you. My name is Bimal Shireen. I just enjoy policy and national security policy as well. In my discussions with various Israeli businessmen, they are beginning to view India as the scalable manufacturer for Israel, for global markets. Do you have an opinion on that, especially as it relates to the various sectors you've discussed?
Sure. Let me start from the last part. Israel now has the trade ministry in Israel, not just the foreign ministry. Trade ministry has 2 or 3 permanent stations in India, including in Bangalore. And so one more aspect that I think is very important is the high-tech sector, which in Israel, of course, is very central. We've all heard of startup nation and all of that. But the prevalence of English in India is very important, the acquaintance of the populations. This all does offer a wide variety of opportunities for business, I think. There are some limitations, especially the kind of manufacturing that Israel does is usually not labor intensive, and so the abundance of labor in India is not always what most of the Israeli industry needs, but some of it is, and in that regard there's complementarity. So the short answer is yes, I think there's a tremendous amount tremendous amount of possible cooperation there. And much of it is already happening, and I think that's probably the sign of a health of the relationship, is that it's happening without some big decision made between prime ministers. It's happening simply because there are semi-normal relations, and there are business interests that are growing already. On the question of relations between Israel and the Sunni Arab states, I'll tie to the Palestinian issue. Kushner and Greenblatt, who's the president's envoy to this, are in Israel right now. This alignment of interests between Israel and the Sunni Arab state has led on both sides to a sense that the profound differences, especially on the Palestinian issue, are, though important, not the first priority. And if Iran or confronting Iran are the first priority for both of them, and in public it's obviously the Israeli first priority, but in private it's most definitely the Saudi first priority, and in public too, then there's a lot of room for cooperation. It's not some big new love affair. It's not that Saudi Arabia discovered that actually believes in Zionism. It's that they think that their main rival, or that their main issue, is not the Palestinian question, and certainly not the specific differences between the latest Israeli offer and the latest Palestinian offer. And also a lot of disenchantment, long-standing disenchantment by some of the Arab states with the Palestinian leadership. Both the Saudis and the Egyptians have cause for frustration with Abbas in particular with regard to the Gaza Strip, with attempts to resolve the differences between Hamas and Fatah, and the seeming unwillingness of Abbas to be forthcoming on that. We're seeing it right just the last couple of weeks with the cutting off of electricity in Gaza. So in that regard, there's opportunity for cooperation. There's a wide variety of ideas about where that would go. Many people have talked about a regional approach, and this is an approach of the administration right now, or it seems to be at least, one which would bring in these regional partners, the Arab Quartet of Egypt, Jordan, the Emiratis, and the Saudis, to support the Palestinians, perhaps nudge the Palestinians towards a deal with Israel. But of course, each one of these parties has different issues in mind. The Palestinians are fearful, and with some reason, that for the Israelis, this is a bypass of the Palestinian issue. You get the prize by going to getting Arab cooperation, perhaps without a full deal with the Palestinians, something that would be very hard to sell in the Arab public, including in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, which it still does matter. So in short, where's the state of things? We don't know where it stands. In part, they are still exploring. Greenblatt has been listening very well. That everyone is talking about that. There seems to be a regional approach in hand, but a regional approach that is, President Trump has said more than once, aimed at the ultimate deal, at reaching a full peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. I tremendously hope I'm wrong, but I remain skeptical that that's available in the short term. And then the question is what is done in the interim that might survive a failure of such negotiations, and where will the president and the American policy be if it fails, and where we stand the morning after. I think those are crucial questions today as well.
On that pessimistic note, thank you all very much for coming to this panel, and for those of you who came for both, thank you to the panelists as well.